This is the Asia Train. I'm Shery in Tokyo.
I'm Haidi, Stroud-Watts in Sydney. The top stories this hour. Multiple investigations begin into the Air India crash that killed all but one of 242 people on board. It is the first loss of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the worst aviation disaster in more than a decade. President Trump says he may raise auto tariffs to boost domestic manufacturing. It's a move that could further ratchet up trade tensions. And Asian stocks set to open higher following Wall Street gains. A solid sale of 30-year treasuries reducing fears that investors are shunning long-term debt.
And to our top story, investigations have begun into the crash of an Air India Dreamliner bound for London, with President Trump promising any assistance the U.S. can offer. The airline says all but one of the 242 people on board the Boeing jet were killed in the crash in Ahmedabad, with teams searching scorched rubble on the ground for any other victims.
We're in the process of deploying a team from the FAA, from the NTSB. We also have GE and Boeing that are deploying their resources and investigators to India. I would just note that India leads the investigation. We're there to provide any assistance that India may need as they go through which appears to be a somewhat lengthy investigation on this crash.
Bloomberg's aviation reporter Daniel Lee joins us now. And Daniel, we haven't seen an air tragedy of this magnitude in quite so many years. What do we know at this point about what happened that led to this crash?
Well, one of the key pieces of information from India's civil aviation regulator is that the pilots in the cockpit issued a mayday call immediately after takeoff. And it gives a sign that there may have been mechanical or technical trouble on board the aircraft during the takeoff, which is one of the most critical phases of flight. And then on top of that, we've seen the multiple videos on social media of the plane and its demise. And experts have been questioning whether there was an issue with the flaps that help the plane take off, or was there enough sufficient power in the engines on the aircraft? So there's lots of questions as to why such a modern, advanced jetliner Boeing builds, which has had an impeccable safety record thus far, could crash. And so there are many questions. And in the early days of what is going to be an investigation that will be needed to get some answers very quickly for an aircraft that is widely used around the world now.
And Danny, as you know, in the immediate aftermath, everyone wants to know what happened, and that leads to a lot of, unhelpful armchair speculation, right? What do we know in terms of how the investigation process will go from here? And is there a timeline in terms of when they might recover the flight data recorder and how quickly that can be analysed?
I think that one of the key things will be to locate the black boxes, indeed the flight data and cockpit voice recorder. I think one of the key things for investigators will be to see and assess whether they are damaged, whether the data can be retrieved in particular. And then beyond that, you will have the Indian authorities leading the air accident investigation with the help of the likes of Boeing, General Electric, the engine maker, and others, including the US counterparts from the NTSB and the FAA. And so that's going to take place very quickly once all the personnel get to India very quickly. But clearly there is a collective shock of what has happened, clearly one of the worst civil aviation disasters in decades, and particularly the fact that this accident it took place just after takeoff in a residential area. So we don't have a full understanding of a higher death toll yet beyond what we know is 241 deaths so far on board this Air India 787.
And Daniel, we know that the 787 has also faced past issues, right, including a grounding more than a decade ago. How detrimental would this be for Boeing?
Well, clearly the investors are waiting and watching very closely, and the stock reaction overnight in the US, Boeing shares fell by the most in 2.5 months. Now, Boeing has faced a litany of issues stemming back to a different kind of aircraft, the single-aisle 737 MAX. Particularly, it had its own global grounding as well. Of course, for the 787, it had challenges in its entry into service, particularly around batteries on the aircraft that were used. And so for Boeing, as it's going through this, comprehensive turnaround led by new CEO Kelly Ottberg, similarly, the kind of turnaround that Air India is undertaking under new ownership of the Tata Group. Now, they're all spending billions to overhaul the company. And so for both organizations, it's quite a shock, and just the need to just quickly understand what went wrong and to try and ensure that these kind of accidents don't happen again.
This is obviously a first when it comes to the Dreamliner, and also one of the worst that we've seen globally for the last decade, but certainly in India as well. But it does come on the back of really a streak of aviation accidents. Is there a way that we can kind of contextualize why we're seeing these disasters?
Aviation still actually remains one of the safest forms of transportation, and we have definitely seen an uptick, Haidi, of accidents, incidents, and obviously notably one of the worst this year in the tragedy of the American Airlines regional jet crashing into or a helicopter crashing into an American Airlines regional jet. I think there's just a huge spotlight as more people travel more than ever, and clearly in the likes of the US, there is continuing questions about the rigor of the infrastructure that helps support and fly so many people every day. But just generally speaking, there has been a huge improvement over the multi-year period in aviation. But clearly, when we have these kind of tragedies, questions will be asked about the quality of, say, the pilots, the planes that are produced, and the infrastructure that helps keep global aviation system safe and growing.
Bloomberg's aviation reporter Danny Lee there with the latest, and of course we'll continue to get more analysis on this Air India crash with Aviation Projects Managing Director Keith Tonkin a little bit later this hour.
Right, Haidi, Bloomberg also learning that the Trump administration is crafting a strategy to use Cold War-era powers to accelerate and fund rare earth projects considered vital to national security. Let's bring in our White House and politics reporter, Stephanie Lai. Stephanie, so how difficult would it be to use these powers, and does it make sense at this point?
Certainly, those are great questions. In terms of how we view the legality of what the administration is doing, a big part of their strategy has been to just implement what they're thinking of and test it within the courts. And so it remains an open question of what could be done. But realistically speaking, if it's something that they've been floating and an idea that they have, and if there is precedent for it in the past, there is a very good likelihood that they at least try and put it into place. And then we see what happens after the fact. And that's exactly what we've seen play out with these tariffs as they've declared a national emergency on a variety of things to be able to push forward with them. And this is sort of the same idea that we're seeing with this Defense Power Act in my view.
Stephanie, how does this sort of fit into some of the more sort of broader, more positive context that we've heard following the 2 days of talks in London with China? Does it suggest that there's still very much, different tracks when it comes to how this trade war, the tariff war, and the threat plays out?
Yeah, I think when we've been looking at the trade deals that they've been negotiating with the 15 or so countries, there is a handful of countries that they've been very narrowly focused on, at least with South Korea, Japan, India. It seems as if the administration has been getting very close to a deal, and that in some ways the U.S. negotiators are just hardening their stances at this point. But I think what's important to note is that Secretary Lutnick had mentioned earlier this week that we aren't expecting any deals until at least next week. And that I think that was a really big discussion leading into the G7, of which the president will be traveling to this weekend. There was discussion that there might be some deals announced before then, but it really does look like the negotiating teams are still ironing out the details, and that if we are to see some new frameworks coming out, it would likely happen at least after the G7 or, into next week.
One of the ones that seem to be pretty advanced are the negotiations with India. But at the same time, I wonder how much it can actually progress when President Trump is already talking about a 25% auto tariff being raised.
I think that remains an open question. Of course, the Indian negotiators have been telling our reporters that, they're hoping to get some sort of carve out from the U.S. on the automobile and sectoral tariffs, at least as it relates to steel. And of course, the U.S. is also pushing back, asking for, more demands in terms of carve-outs for pharmaceuticals and, apologies, I believe that they've been asking for price controls on pharmaceuticals, as well as, just generally speaking, ways in which that they can bring more U.S. products into the country.
Bloomberg's White House and politics reporter Stephanie Lai there with the latest on those trade negotiations ongoing right now. We're continuing to watch some of those car makers in the Asian session. Of course, we're setting up for the major market opens, but car makers will be one of the industries that we'll be watching because of the impact of these tariffs coming from President Trump. And you can see Nikkei futures to the downside of 0.2%. The Nikkei already fell for the first time in 5 sessions. Of course, I talked about the tariff uncertainty, but we do also have more data from the U.S., perhaps showing a little bit of more softening in the economy. What we'll be watching in today's session is Asian currencies on the other side of the dollar being under pressure. Take a look at how U.S. futures are trading at the moment, because we saw the dollar falling now to the weakest level in about 3 years. It's down about 8% year to date, and we had U.S. producer price inflation coming in pretty muted for the month of May. So we have more bets that the Fed will cut rates more this year. So worries over U.S. tariffs, the outlook of the U.S. economy, something that's really affected the markets. We continue to watch Treasury yields, downward momentum. That 30-year Treasury auction saw stronger than expected demand. Let's discuss and bring in Bloomberg MLive strategist Mark Cranfield. Mark, so we were watching the 10-year auction, the 30-year auction very closely this week. What is this signaling about the demand out there from investors about U.S. assets?
Yeah, a lot of relief. We had a decent run of auctions, including the 3-year as well. That went pretty well, and the 10s and the 30s. I think you probably have to take into account that the 30-year especially, traders are probably positioned short going into that auction. They were probably expecting it to be worse than it actually was. So some of the demand there is actually people reducing those positions. So it's partly about what traders were doing ahead of that. If you look at the details of the 30-year auction, it wasn't particularly spectacular. It was a fairly average auction, but at least the general mood is a bit of a Goldilocks one. If you think of the US dollar was down, equities had a good day, bond markets did well. So all in all, nobody really wants to fight something like that, particularly when you have a Federal Reserve meeting coming up next week. And in the background as well, Scott Bessent's name is being pushed around as the potential being the next Federal Reserve chairman, and markets will like that. They'll feel comfortable if somebody like Bessent is going to take over from Jerome Powell. So all in all, it's been a pretty solid week for anybody who's looking at markets in general. The risk mood is good, and there's no reason to particularly go against it for the time being. It's going to be a pretty lively weekend, though. We've got the G7 meeting going on as well, so things could change over there. But for now, you've got a general trend, a feel-good factor that nobody wants to fight, and that includes the bond market for now. So we expect a fairly benign day in the Treasury market today. Dollar probably continue to be reasonably weak against Asian currencies especially, although it's going to be interesting with the PBOC's fixing today. They'll probably push back a bit. The yuan strengthened a bit too much for their liking overnight, so you'll probably see them at the fix today nudge that slightly the other direction. But you can see the momentum is fantastic for currencies against the US dollar. Look at the euro, above 116 overnight on huge trading volumes. It was a significant day in the options market that saw people buying position exposure for the euro to go even stronger. So that's leading the pack there. So Goldilocks is the theme for now, and it's unlikely that Asia's going to fight it today.
How does that feed into the Fed? Because the sort of drift towards softer data, and that's before we've even sort of seen the tariff-related shocks potentially play out in the second half. How is that likely to be sort of approached by Chair Powell? And clearly there's this also building narrative of perhaps we'll get, a more dovish replacement for him and therefore a more dovish Fed going forward too.
Well, Well, Mr. Powell probably won't comment on who's going to replace him. That's not something that he's likely to do. But he'll be relieved that the inflation data this week, especially, it was a nice benign report. There's nothing to worrying him in there. He can keep a steady hand on things. What would have really upset the Fed would be if we'd had a hot inflation number. That would make life very difficult for them. If inflation expectations are rising too quickly in the situation where they are, where the market is actually pricing for the Fed to cut rates again, and then you get a hot inflation number. And everyone knows that the Fed's hands are mostly tied in this environment. They are not going to be raising interest rates, and it's going to be difficult for them even to speak very hawkishly. So from their point of view, it's a very comfortable outcome. So we'll get a very neutral reading from the Fed next week. Jerome Powell will do pretty much what he did in the previous press conference. He'll tread a very narrow line carefully between hawks and doves, and he'll try to keep the market as calm as possible. So all in all, it's unlikely to be a big market-moving event, the Fed next week. People will be looking ahead to the next jobs data. They'll be looking ahead to external factors, particularly what's going on in Europe as well. If the trade dispute between the US and Europe takes a lot longer, that would affect European markets, which could spin back into the US as well. So for now, the Fed is not a major one, but investors will be reassured that if Jerome Powell's term comes to an end next year, that the next person is likely to be a very experienced hand, and that's a good thing.
Bloomberg's Mark Bramfield there. Coming up on the Asia trade, the former Assistant US Trade Representative Reade joins us with her outlook for tariff negotiations. We're going to get more, of course, when it comes to the latest for the Air India disaster with the consultancy Aviation projects. The University of Virginia, a little bit later on, will be weighing in with us on escalating tensions in the Middle East. Much more ahead. This is Bloomberg. President Trump says Israel could strike Iran, but says he's advised against an attack. It comes as negotiations over Tehran's nuclear program are ongoing. Let's bring our Bloomberg editor Michael Heath. And this, of course, we had the report that there was readiness and hence moving US personnel out of key locations. But, I mean, he has the point. This would not help ongoing talks, which will continue over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump's advisor is in Oman on Sunday for the 6th round of talks, so you'd presume nothing is going to happen until then. The question I guess people are sort of grappling with is this President Trump using sort of Israel as leverage? Is it a good cop, bad cop scenario, or is it a situation that if the talks collapse, then all bets are off and Israel might potentially go in? I mean, Iran with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat to Israel, or it's viewed by Israel as an existential threat, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has said this repeatedly on numerous occasions. So that's sort of where things stand, that those talks are going to be the key issue. Meanwhile, we've had the Atomic Energy Agency sent to Iran, and Iran coming back saying it's going to enrich, it's open a new enrichment facility, and that's sort of at the heart of these talks with the US, that the US doesn't want Iran doing more enrichment, because obviously it can be a fuel for a nuclear weapon as well as a domestic energy source. So it just, I guess, whether anybody blinks here or where we stand. I mean, the fear, I guess, is that given Israel, when it had that tit for tat with Iran, it managed to knock out its air defences. It probably feels like it's in a fairly good position to attack if it needs to. But Israel also doesn't have the weapons that could probably really knock out the program, which is fairly dispersed in the underground, these sorts of things. So the talk is that it would need to undertake repeated attacks, which would be very, very difficult logistically to do. Axios is reporting that the US won't be involved with Israel if it does go ahead, but it will probably provide some sort of intelligence at least anyway. So yeah, that's sort of where we stand at this stage. Fairly tense times.
I mean, these talks have been going on and off for a while, negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. Are there any low-hanging fruits where there could be some sort of breakthrough to move this along?
Yeah, Shery. I mean, look, the question, I guess, is whether they can find some sort of middle ground on this enrichment. I mean, Iran's obviously put a lot of money into and a lot of resources into this as well, and it's maintained from the outset that it doesn't want a nuclear weapon, but basically non-partisan groups, whether the the International Atomic Energy Agency, basically say that what they're doing could go either way. So whether you believe that or not. But when the Obama administration struck a deal with Iran, there was the ability to do that. Again, it's just whether, there's not much confidence on either side here, and the US and Trump has been very strong on this for a long, long period, that they're not going to allow them to enrich, they're not going to allow them to get a weapon, and Israel obviously is twice as strong as that. So it doesn't seem so. It's just a matter of whether they can find a path through that, and whether they sense, I guess, on either side that there's enough goodwill to actually try to achieve something here.
Michael Heath, always good to catch up with you. Mike there with the latest on the tensions around Iran. Other stories that we're following at this point. Police in Los Angeles have used horses and what they describe as less lethal munitions to break up anti-deportation protests. Marines deployed by President Trump are also expected to arrive later Friday to back up 4,000 National Guard troops who've been on the ground all week. California Governor Gavin Newsom has sought a court order to limit military involvement. The U.S. House has approved over $9 billion in budget cuts proposed by Elon Musk. Doge. The bill, which was passed with a narrow 214 to 212 vote, include cuts to foreign aid and public broadcasting. But the spending calls face an uncertain future in the Senate, where moderates have voiced opposition and could strip some of those cuts out of the bill. The U.S. says Huawei's ability to produce AI semiconductors this year will be very limited. Commerce Department Under Secretary Jeffrey Kessler told a congressional hearing that the company will only be able to make 200,000 of its Ascend AI chips this year, mostly for delivery within China. Kessler also argued for increased funding for export control programs to counter China's technology advances. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Let's get you the latest from the corporate front. And Bloomberg sources say Apple has set an internal release target of spring 2026 for a delayed upgrade of its voice assistant Siri. The long-promised changes will allow Siri to tap into consumers' personal data and on-screen activity to better fulfill queries. We're told Apple's aiming to deliver the revamp as part of an iOS software update, marking a key step in its key AI turnaround effort. Tencent said to be studying a potential deal for South Korea's Nexon, the Chinese internet giant looking for ways to bolster its gaming operations. Sources say it's reached out to the family of Nexon's late founder to discuss the possibility of an acquisition. That family holds a majority in Nexon stakes through investment firms and said to be evaluating options. Well, President Trump floating higher auto tariffs to try and boost domestic manufacturing in the auto sector. Let's get the latest when it comes to these ongoing trade murmurings and negotiations. Let's bring in Claire Reade, who's a senior counsel at Arnold and Porter. She previously worked at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. And Claire, we sort of started out the week with some tentative optimism over US-China talks, and certainly that was followed by a pretty exuberant update, at least from the US side. The Chinese side, of course, staying a little bit more on the conservative side. But at the same time, we've also since then heard President Trump is looking at putting in place again these unilateral tariffs before the July deadline, and now also talking about auto tariffs to try and boost domestic manufacturing. So it's very clearly not a black and white situation. Do you think the trade picture has improved?
I think the serious crash in the bond market and that flight that took place after Trump's most well, I guess his major activities in April created an environment where there's a little more caution, not a lot of caution, but a little more caution. So I think that is helpful to considering the trade prospects for the future. But I think there's still a massive amount of uncertainty for businesses because I don't think there is a clear strategy coming out of the Trump administration. I think it's quite opportunistic and, let me say, spontaneous.
And sort of, you know, the subtext being unpredictable, right, or unreliable. You make a good point. How much are we seeing this feed through to kind of a permanent shift in confidence for businesses? It's very difficult to invest around things that might be changing from day to day or hour to hour.
Absolutely. And I think now what's happening is you're seeing, for example, with the latest China-US detente, China has created some stability in the critical minerals, you know, rare earths, magnets sector, but only for 6 months. So we're looking at the uncertainties now developing not only from U.S. policy, but from reactive policies from other trading partners in the global economy. So the concerns are significant for businesses in terms of trying to understand how to plan.
We have seen the U.S. now sort of shift its approach to trade talks. I mean, we didn't think that export controls would actually be on the table. They seem that perhaps they might be. At this point, with the little information that we are getting from the negotiators, do you get a sense of who's winning?
I don't know that anybody is winning. I would say that the United States is, I don't think anyone is winning. I just really don't think they are. There's no permanent advantages to either China or the United States coming from these interactions. I think they're just reinforcing for China the need to reduce reliance on the United States as effectively as they can, and in the short run to, you know, try to gain technology and other positives from U.S. companies, but not with any plan to create a broad, wide trade and investment open environment going forward.
Claire, when you look at the trade negotiations, given everything that President Trump and his administration has to deal with, including, of course, the new tensions around Iran, including the new tensions just domestically with the protests across the United States, anti-immigration, over deportations during because of immigration policies. How much does all of this distract the administration from engaging with 100+ countries?
Well, I think Trump has demonstrated that he is extremely interested in trade. So I don't know that these other requirements of the presidency are going to distract him personally. And I will say that the negotiators who are working on these deals are not the same folks who are working on Iran or are concerned about the domestic protests in Los Angeles, for example. So the real problem for the trade negotiators is the one you pointed to, which is the number of significant difficulties in the volume of countries that are interested in trying to come up with something.
the sheer sort of heft required to be able to get through all those negotiations. But for the key one, for US-China, how much space is there to actually negotiate, given that we know that this has moved beyond just, straightforward tariffs to market access, and at that market access, when it comes to very strategically sensitive, national security related, competitive spaces like rare earths, like nuclear, like technology, is there sort of even room to be able to compromise on those topics?
Well, there was skepticism at the outset, and I think the recent skirmish between China and the United States in precisely these areas with export controls and the other non-tariff policy measures that are now on the table, it demonstrates how hard it's going to be. I think it is possible that there could be some compromises and some de-escalation of tariffs or of restrictions through things that are very benign and non-controversial, like more purchases of U.S. goods by China. But China will only do that to the extent it's in their interests. I don't see there being any magnificent paradigm shift in the relationship. I think China is very skeptical, has reason to be skeptical of the United States viewpoint, regardless of what President Trump is saying about, opportunities for more open trade. And I think there are many, many in the United States who are concerned about the national security dimension that is created by providing sensitive products and services to China. So even if President Trump is not as concerned, I think he will be constrained politically because he can't be seen as giving away U.S. national security to China. So there's a very narrow path, I think.
Reade, good to have you back, Senior Counsel at Arnold & Porter, as we continue to follow those trade negotiations around the world. Take a look at how we're setting up for the market opens across Asia. We have seen a little bit of downside this week, especially with stocks falling for the first time in 4 sessions. Of course, we had President Trump talking about more unilateral tariffs to come within 2 weeks, not to mention that he also mentioned increasing the auto tariffs currently at that 25% level. You can see U.S. futures to a downside of about 0.25% in the U.S. after closing at the highest since February, just a touch below its all-time high. But we were watching was a Treasury space because the yields has seen some downward momentum, especially with not only benign inflation data, but the 30-year Treasury auction also seeing stronger than expected demand. Former Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Richard Clarida now warning that a reckoning for U.S. debt is, quote, inevitable, but likely won't happen in the next 5 years. PIMCO's global economic advisors told us investors should brace for an era of fragmentation.
Very straightforward. The world's fragmenting into regional security alliances, trading blocs, currency zones. The process has been underway for a while, but it's accelerated under Trump 2.0. We point out it has important implications for the economy and markets. We see business cycles being amplified, markets being more volatile, but importantly, there are opportunities for investors in the fragmentation era to identify what's driving returns and repricing risk.
Well, let's identify what the economic characteristics are of the era of fragmentation and what it means for the so-called long bond. Does it mean a less dependable bond bid for a 30-year maturity?
Well, we're not sure. We think what it does mean is there's a very large stock of debt in the U.S. and around the world as we come into the era of fragmentation. And so we do see already in market pricing a higher term premium. Our judgment right now is at the very long end of the curve for most investors, you're not getting paid enough to take on 3 times the interest rate risk, which is our preference for the belly of the curve. So that's the most immediate point I guess I would make.
What's your reaction when you hear Jeffrey Gundlach say a reckoning is coming to the U.S. and the U.S. debt market?
Our baseline view is that a reckoning is inevitable, but not our baseline for the next 5 years. We think the action-forcing event in Washington to get our fiscal house in order will probably be in the next decade when the Medicare and Social Security trust funds are exhausted. We could be wrong. At some level, I hope we're wrong, because an earlier reckoning means that we get our fiscal house in order. But our baseline is that that's something in the next decade.
When you see these concerns of the U.S. debt market, and then you also have this view that there's this fragmentation going on in the world, what does this mean for U.S. exceptionalism? Is it over? Is it waning? Or potentially, could it reemerge in Trump 2.0?
We think it could reemerge for the following reason. As we come into the era of fragmentation, there's a lot to like about the U.S. Strong productivity growth, an innovative economy, more or less efficient capital markets, and those attributes have not gone away. There's a lot of uncertainty now, a lot of it generated about U.S. trade policy and security policy, but over time, Anne-Marie, that will get sorted out. And as that goes into the rearview mirror, we think there's a decent shot that the exceptionalism mean returns.
Former Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Richard Clarida, they're speaking with Bloomberg Surveillance. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
More now on the crash of Air India Flight 171, which has turned 2025 into one of the deadliest years in the past decade for civil aviation. The Boeing 787 heading from Ahmedabad to London crashed soon after takeoff, killing all but one of the 242 people on board. For more, let's bring in Keith Tonkin, Managing Director and Principal Consultant at Aviation Projects, which specializes in airport operations and safety. Keith, good to have you with us. To begin with, could you give us your early assessment of the situation around the crash and if anything stands out to you?
It's great to be with you today, and reflecting on the circumstances of this accident, it must be quite horrific for the family and friends and loved ones of all the people that were on board that aircraft to see what was an aircraft and now is in pieces, and the damage that's been caused to all of the buildings and infrastructure around that site is really very confronting for everybody. So what we are seeing is that the aircraft impacted the ground at relatively high speed and caused very significant damage to itself and that surrounding area. And now the safety rescue teams and the safety investigators have the task of retrieving all the bodies, identifying them and returning them to their families, and then finding out what went wrong.
Of course, we're still trying to get some more clarity as the investigation continues into the crash. But what we know so far, which is a fact, is that we have seen a serious rise of air safety incidents this year. We're only half a year in, and we might get one of the deadliest years in aviation history. So are you seeing any troubling trends and perhaps an indication of why this might be happening?
Yeah, well, that's right. We have seen a number of very significant fatal accidents over the last 5 months or so this year. And that goes against the trend, which we have witnessed, where safety has increasingly become more reliable, that aircraft have been more reliable, and that we are not seeing those fatal accidents. And the recent ones we've had in different places around the world with different aircraft in different circumstances really tell us that the aviation industry is having some difficulties, and we're not sure if there's a worldwide trend or some reason that that's happening, but we definitely want to find out why this accident occurred and to try and make sure that whatever those causes were are avoided for the future.
We know that the Dreamliner has had a pretty impeccable safety record until this point. There's a lot of speculation, some of it, most of it, I'd imagine, fairly unhelpful at this point, but there is a lot of focus when it comes to the positioning of the flaps as well as what the landing gear was doing. What do you think the investigators will be focusing on from the outset, and particularly as presumably they'll soon recover the flight data and the cockpit recorder data as well?
That's right. They'll be very interested to understand what the pilots were saying through the voice recorder and to understand the configuration of the aircraft in terms of how much thrust the engines were producing, what configuration the lift devices were in, whether they set appropriately. And we know that the landing gear was down, and it's interesting to understand why that was. And once we understand all of those different factors, we understand that the aircraft wasn't making enough thrust and lift to keep airborne, that the drag created by the landing gear may have overcome whatever benefit those other parts of the lift drag, weight and thrust equation were appropriate then. So they'll be very interested to understand all of the settings of the aircraft and what the pilots were doing and when, and how the situation eventuated.
What do you expect in terms of the timeline for such an investigation? We know that it's going to be multinational in terms of contribution from the US, and obviously a lot of people are watching to see, the role of Boeing, the role of the engine manufacturer, and there's a lot of unknowns at this point. But how do you expect this to play out in terms of how quickly we could know some more details?
Yeah, well, everyone will definitely want to know the reasons for this accident as quickly as possible, and that's a natural feeling to have. We want to explain things as best we can, as soon as we can. And some preliminary information may become available in the next few days and weeks, but the overall findings, the analysis of all the information will take some time, most likely into a number of years. So it's going to be a long time to get all of the details of the situation to help people understand it. But there will be some preliminary findings that will help in the short term to explain what we know and what might be done in the very short term in terms of the aircraft or the operations.
Keith, really great to have you with us. Keith Tonkin, who's a Managing Director at Principal Consultant at Aviation Projects. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a look at what we're seeing across commodities, and of course we have further geopolitical uncertainties playing out at the moment. We have seen that rise when it comes to oil prices at 2-month highs. We're also seeing that haven demand for gold playing out back above 3,400. Some catch up when it comes to other precious metals and commodities, platinum there. We're seeing that sort of Middle East really risk premium playing out as President Trump seeing an escalation in Middle East tensions. We're also now hearing from the Financial Times saying that a strike on Iran by Israel could come as early as Friday, so later on today, according to people familiar with military discussions in the country, as reported by the Financial Times. President Trump had said that attack could very well happen. He's advised against it happening, certainly before the next round of talks that are set to take place in Oman over the weekend. He said that he didn't think a strike was imminent, but that there was a risk of massive conflict. But we're now hearing that FT reporting that people familiar with these discussions in Israel saying that a military strike could come even earlier than some had expected. And Shery, you see that risk premium very clearly playing out across some of these key commodities.
Yeah, and really these assets so important when it comes to the auto industry as well. Let's turn to electric vehicles because the price war in China has weighed heavily on automaker shares, with BYD losing around $22 billion in market cap since peaking in late May. The EV giant's executive vice president Stella says Chinese rivals should focus on sharpening their own strategies rather than copy BYD's playbook. In an exclusive interview, we asked her if the aggressive price war sparked by her company is sustainable.
No, it's not sustainable. So this is it's like it's a kind of a very extreme, tough competition. So yeah, it's a BYD. Because all our competition dropped the price, then always like duplicate what we're doing, learning. We become number one, so everybody follow what we do. We're launching this model today. 2 months later, our competition was launching similar model, bigger, but the price will be 10 or 20,000, then maybe cheaper. So you have to survive, but this is not healthy. So I would rather everybody focus on their own technology, their own sales strategy, their own marketing strategy, not always copy and duplicate and play price war.
So to be clear, you don't think the EV price war that we're seeing in China is sustainable?
No.
Do you think it leads to consolidation?
There is already happening some consolidation, but then you see because once you move to the certain maturity level, then you have to consolidate, and then the brand of the auto company will be maybe reduced. Yeah.
Do you expect to see a similar price war in Europe, given the competition here now?
No, I don't think so, because in Europe it's more than the price. You need to give the service, you need to give the trust, you need to have a financial capability, then you need to have the people trust. It's a more mature market. I would say auto industry in China is growing, even we're the largest auto industry now, but still comparing with Europe, it's not mature enough. So come to Europe, it's not just you bring one car, then sell the super low price. Still a lot of people buy, because they were asking, oh, how about 3 months, 6 months, if I have some trouble, who I should call? So it's then this become the benefit for the local OEM. So now they are just behind a little bit on technology. So if they can catch up for innovation, they still have a very strong foundation.
BYD Executive Vice President Stella speaking to Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie. And we're, of course, headed to the major market opens. We'll be watching Nexon, which is a South Korean game developer, after Bloomberg broke the news that Tencent is mulling a potential deal with this company. Market opens in Sydney, Seoul, and Tokyo are next. This is Bloomberg. This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. We'll continue to watch for volatility. Haidi, of course, we are still digesting President Trump's comments when it comes to unilateral tariffs, not to mention auto tariffs that could go up. And perhaps, as Bloomberg is now reporting, that he could potentially use cold era powers in order to accelerate the development of rare earths.
At the same time, in addition to the ongoing trade uncertainties, there's brewing geopolitical uncertainties when it comes to the Middle East. We're now hearing reporting from the FT suggesting that we could see as early as Friday that strike by Israel on Iran. So we're seeing that reaction across commodities very clearly today, Shery.
Yeah, oil actually rebounding from losses earlier, and we'll be watching those energy stocks in today's trading session as we continue to watch those safe havens as well. We saw the Japanese yen gain against the U.S. dollar in the overnight session, a lot to do with just dollar weakness, because we saw that plunge to those lows that we haven't seen in about 3 years. But take a look at the Nikkei, now down for a second consecutive session, and the Japanese yen strengthening a little bit right now against the greenback. Of course, we did get some solid auction for the 30-year yield in Treasury, so we'll be watching the bond space right now with the JGB in the 10-year at that 142 level. We'll also be watching one company traded in Japan, which is South Korean developer Nexon, because Bloomberg now has learned that Tencent is looking at a potential deal there. Take a look at how the Kospi and the Kosdaq are coming online, because we'll be watching the Korean won also being a little bit sustained given the weakness in the U.S. dollar. You can see it there at that 1353 level, and the Kospi now gaining 0.4%. Of course, Haidi, as I mentioned earlier, still digesting any comments around that tariff uncertainty coming from the Trump administration.
Yeah, ongoing as that uncertainty is. Take a look, Shery, when it comes to how we're playing out when it comes to this final session. Here in Australia, of course, a staggered open. A little bit of downside or softness there when it comes to the ASX. We're watching the little bit of a pullback in the Aussie dollar, of course. The trajectory has been for that dollar weakness, and we could still see that with a combination of what we saw with the Treasuries auction and a little bit more of a relief when it comes to the longer end of the Treasury market. We could see that yield effect giving some lift to Asian currencies as well. Treasuries at the moment looking like this. It feels like perhaps the sort of doom and gloom might have been a little bit overpriced by investors going into that 30-year auction, but it spurred that certainly some respite after what has been weeks of angst when it comes to the question marks over demand for longer-term, longer-tenured US debt. We're also watching, of course, oil markets very closely, as you say, that bounce back again from crude rising to around those 2-month highs as President Trump and others seeing the risk of potentially even imminent escalation of events in the Middle East.
Right, Haidi. For more on the markets, let's bring in Mizuho Securities Asia Managing Director Sean Darby. And it seems right now, Sean, that we continue to see the support for Asian currencies, especially with dollar weakness. We had PPI data. Really inflation across the board in the U.S. Sort of muted, not to mention, of course, that we're following the latest Treasury auctions. How's what's happening in the U.S. markets right now being really reflected across Asian assets?
Well, I think for Asian emerging markets, you've got one of the probably the best backdrops for equity market performance. You have a weakening dollar. You have the US running above average inflation. Notwithstanding the Israel-Iran tensions, oil prices have been heading south for the best part of the last 6 or so months. And in particular for Asian EM, China's going to export a wave of deflation into these economies, so import prices are set to drop. So the bond markets in Asia and EM are actually very, very strong now, and not only that, corporate credit spreads remain very tight, and you've got this really nice backdrop of low or disinflation coming through in through the economies, allowing these central banks to decouple from the Federal Reserve. And you saw that sort of five trading days ago when India surprisingly cut by 50 basis points. So I think the tailwind for Asian EM within the whole context of both the US and China is almost perfect.
Sean, as we were talking about the potential imminent Israeli operations in Iran, we're now seeing that confirmation. Axios reporting actually that Israel has conducted an airstrike in Iran. The Israeli Air Force conducting that strike in Iran on Thursday. This is according, though, to 2 sources with knowledge of the operation. It's not clear from this reporting what Israel is targeting. And we know that they had been reporting that potentially these operations could begin as early as Friday. We know that the White House and President Trump had sort of advised against that, particularly with ongoing talks with Iran and the US over the weekend. How do you look at this through the prism of risk? Obviously, key commodities, havens and energy markets, alongside others, have already been seeing a strong reaction.
So I think from the backdrop over the last 24 hours, I would still say that risk assets are likely to do reasonably well. One is, as you've alluded to earlier, we had some strong auctions in the United States, so bond markets have actually been very favorable. Unless the strikes by Israel have disrupted the shipping of crude oil, I don't think it's going to have a long-lasting impact on the energy markets. The decision by OPEC Plus to increase production for a 3rd consecutive month really means that the supply side for crude oil is really very much intact. And of course, the United States itself is in full production mode as well, and it's now, of course, the largest oil producer. So in the sense of the bigger picture, I don't think necessarily that the energy markets are going to be too disrupted by this, unless, of course, it's one that actually impacts the shipping of the of crude oil or gas.
Yeah, we're seeing the immediate reaction in the markets. Oil, of course, rising, bonds also jumping, U.S. futures also falling on the reports of that explosion in Tehran. But, Sean, when it comes to the bond space, are we going to see further appeal now, given, of course, the ongoing uncertainties and concerns that investors had perhaps on Treasury assets, given, of course, the rising and spiraling fiscal situation? Could we see a return to the bond space?
Well, I think a couple of coinciding factors have been hitting G7 bonds all at the same time. Really, one is that both US and Japan have been still doing quantitative tightening, which has upset a lot of the bond dealers because there's an ongoing supply. Secondly, both for the US and Japan, term premium, or that inflation adjustment, has also been rising steadily over the last 2.5 years, and it's now starting to somewhat get embedded into bond markets. I think the third is that we have to sort of recognize, as you mentioned, that the US is not only going to run very large fiscal deficits, but also much larger, in much higher inflation rates than we've seen over the last 20 years. So I think these bond rallies will occur from time to time, but it's not really going to make a generic case for bond markets in the G7. And certainly I think in the United States they're going to have to offer higher long-term term premiums to encourage buyers to enter. Just to highlight that, the bulk of new issuance over the last couple of the years has been at the short end. So the US Treasury has been financing using short-term debt, but it's going to have to switch over to the long part of the curve and extend the duration. And really, that's going to be one of the projects for the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to do that without making the bond markets finding the supply indigestible. So I think the story for bonds, fixed income in G7 is a little bit more mixed now. We're going to have a much more stickier inflation rate, and I think it's going to make bond rallies less frequent. And certainly the equity bond correlation is going to be moving back back into positive territory in the United States after a 22-year hiatus of negative correlations.
As we continue to watch that market reaction, bonds jumping, S&P futures sliding, WTI crude oil extending that surge to 4% now on the Iran airstrike reports. We're hearing reports of successive explosions being reported in Tehran, and it's interesting, we're seeing that downside for the dollar, upside when it comes to the bid for treasuries. In this sort of environment, does it make the sort of ever popular defence theme, particularly in Europe, more compelling?
I think the defence theme globally is very much one which has come back into focus. Defence spending as a percentage of GDP has dropped from 9% back in the late 1970s to around about 2 or below 3% of GDP globally. So we've had a really extended bear market in defence spending. The good news is that defence spending only has one customer, which is primarily a government. And also the good news is that the number of players in this industry has shrunk as you've had a series of mergers and as the industry itself has had to consolidate. And whether it's in the more hardware areas like tanks or ships, or now in the software areas of cybersecurity, I think defence spending is in now a really long-term bull market, and that those players, whether in Japan or Korea or the United States, are going to see robust order books for the best part of the next 5 to 10 years. So as a part of the equity markets, it's a space that Mizuho continues to like.
Sean, really great to have you with us. Mizuho Securities Asia Managing Director Sean Darby there. And to our other top stories, and investigations have begun into the crash of an Air India Dreamliner bound for London, with President Trump promising any assistance that the US can offer. The airline says all but one of the 242 people on board the Boeing jet were killed in the crash in Ahmedabad, with teams searching scorched rubble on the ground for any other victims. Bloomberg's aviation reporter Danny Lee joins us, and of course, in addition to those who were on the plane, there are also a lot of unconfirmed, and at this point we don't know know how many people may have seen what the fatalities are when it comes to those who are on the ground as this aircraft made its descent. What do we know at this moment, given that obviously the search for the black box materials is still ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first significant developments that came in the aftermath of the 787 aircraft crash was that the India Civil Aviation Authority saying that the pilots on board the plane issued a mayday call. So clearly that's a sign that perhaps the pilots were facing some kind of technical or mechanical trouble. And in some social media videos, we see the plane taking off, and it lasted less than 30 seconds or around 30 seconds in the air before the plane gradually descended from a peak altitude of 625 feet and crashing just outside the airport into a residential area. And so for that one survivor of the 242 passengers and crew on board, as you said, indeed, we don't know yet if there is a higher fatality rate, particularly because of where this plane crashed. But of course, for India, they're suffering the worst civil aviation accident in more than a decade worldwide, and for Air India, one of the worst in almost 4 decades as well.
We're only 6 months into the new year, and we seem to be headed towards one of the worst in aviation history. What's going on?
Well, clearly there is a high level of scrutiny, given we've had such dramatic accidents, particularly not least the crash between a helicopter, a U.S. military helicopter, and an American Airlines regional jet. But it still is that aviation is one of the safest modes of transport. But given the kind of accidents we've had over the past couple of years, really spectacular crashes, footages that we have seen circulate, the death toll has inevitably piled up.
We're standing Lee there with the latest on the Air India crash there. As we continue to watch also the markets broadly on geopolitical tensions, of course, we continue to hear reports about an attack on Iran. And in the meantime, we're seeing Japanese stocks dropping on that report of airstrikes on Iran. We're also seeing bonds turning higher, not to mention that U.S. futures are also falling. Oil, obviously, also jumping at the moment. This is Bloomberg.
We have now breaking news. The Israeli Defense Minister Katz saying that he's declaring a state of emergency due to the preemptive strikes against Iran. So in essence, the confirmation of what we've been reporting already, declaring that state of emergency due to the anticipation of retaliatory attacks from Iran after the commencement of these airstrikes. Iranian state TV reporting loud sounds and explosions being heard in parts of Tehran there. And we heard that original reporting from both the Israeli Defense Minister as well as other reporting that the airstrikes began for Iran on Friday morning. So we're seeing that big market reaction when it comes to risk off, going into havens, bid up for bonds as well as gold, as well as, of course, another surge when it comes to WTI crude oil. Let's bring in for more our Bloomberg editor Michael Heath. A lot changes in what just I think we spoke about half an hour ago or something like that. But it's really interesting to me that this has come despite President Trump pretty, overtly advising against it, at least until after these negotiations have gone a little bit further.
Yeah, it's interesting, and there's obviously a lot of reports going on around at the moment. But there's been a couple that have suggested that the US was behind the scenes warning allies that something was going to happen in the next 12 hours. Shortly after I got off TV half an hour ago, the Financial Times was reporting that it could happen in 6 to 12 hours. And I guess the talks are sort of what makes it confusing and complicated. I mean, we're hearing that what we've got is reports from state TV in Iran saying that there's been sounds of explosions in Tehran. Now, whether that means they're attacking the nuclear site or the nuclear sites have been attacked or what is really unclear at the moment. Presumably that is the case. But the other thing is that Israel's obviously going to want to do something. You tend to find out these things after the event has happened. So presumably their thinking is they can't wait until after those talks on Sunday. But yeah, we're sort of lacking clarity at the moment on what's going on. President Trump, what he was saying about about Israel, sort of warning Israel against not doing it or suggesting Israel shouldn't do it. By the same token, he did make a slip that perhaps, this could help negotiations or hinder negotiations. I mean, it's hard to see how they'd help them. Presumably, Israel now, it's declared a state of emergency. It's bracing for retaliation from Iran. The US obviously was moving its diplomats out. We had reports about that yesterday from Baghdad and other areas, because Iran has said that if it is attacked, that it is prepared to respond against Western targets or US targets in the Middle East area. So then the question just becomes what happens with oil, what happens with the Straits of Hormuz, all these sort of things, or whether this can be contained. The two times it did happen previously, they did manage to just keep it contained, but it's sort of quite difficult to see that that will be the case this time, given the tensions that have been rising. It's
interesting, even one former director of Israeli military intelligence that we spoke to very recently said as long as the US and Iran are still negotiating, an attack is, quote, inconceivable. Yeah. Clearly not. I do wonder, we've also had other reporting from sort of, commentary from advisors to Netanyahu saying that if there is an operation, it will be fairly limited, but these things can spiral, right? What do we expect in terms of retaliation and I guess the role that potentially gets played by Iranian proxies around the region too? Well, the proxies is Israel would probably feel more confident on that because it's obviously the big proxy was Hezbollah, and they've defanged or got rid of a lot of the missiles that Hezbollah had there. So that's perhaps not quite as much of a worry. But Iran obviously has quite a substantial number of missiles, and we saw that they did unleash these barrages last time this happened. The first time there was a lot of warning about it all, and that allowed the US and its allies in the region to shoot them down. Now, obviously, Israel has missile defence, but whether it can, how many it could stop if that happens is really unclear. And also whether whether Iran does then, go after perhaps in Iraq or in Saudi Arabia or these sorts of areas, whether it chooses oil facilities or something like that. I mean, it has a lot of options there. Presumably, it's going to focus on Israel, you'd imagine. I mean, Israel is the source of this attack. They're going to be wanting to respond there. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of caught everyone by surprise, and I guess that's the whole point of it, of what Israel's done there, is that it wants to act before anyone, before Iran has a chance to brace for this. Yeah. So.
Is that the feeling of the need to move in a timely manner what really led Israel to act? Because with President Trump publicly opposing this, I wonder why Israel is going ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know how much, whether Trump's saying sort of one thing, knowing that another thing is going to happen. I mean, the US and Israel relationship is extremely tight. No matter what anybody says about tensions between Trump and Netanyahu, which I'm sure do exist, the US has always been rock solid with Israel. So it's certainly, whether it wanted this or not, it's certainly going to stand by Israel and try and help it defend itself here. I think there'd be no question about that. And there would, at least, from some of the reports we saw, that the US was warning that this could happen in 12 hours' time, within 6 to 12 hours' time. There was some sense that it was going to happen. So it's very, very difficult to know whether the public commentary was designed to perhaps mislead Iran or whether this is a genuine surprise from the US side. But, now that this has happened, I think we'd all anticipate that the US would stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel in trying to defend it from any Iranian retaliation.
How do you come back from this? I mean, how do you go back into a negotiating room after these airstrikes? Is there any ground for compromise at this point?
Yeah, well, look, it's difficult to know, Shery, because part of the problem is that, before this actually happened, a lot of the thinking was, well, the pressure's sort of being built on Iran to try and get it to see that this is that nobody is this isn't threats. This is going to happen, and they need to secure a diplomatic deal, because there will be military consequences otherwise. Now, whether this is this isn't an all-out attack, whether it's a strike that suggests that this could happen, or whether it's the beginning of something more. It's really hard to judge at this stage, and I wouldn't want to say more than we know at this point, which is we've heard these explosions, reports of these explosions around Tehran. Israel's obviously under a state of emergency, that sort of thing. But, all sides would prefer that, certainly the Western sides would prefer that Iran just agrees to, and President Trump said this, that it agrees to do a deal, and that the US can lift sanctions and everyone can proceed. But Iran also is very, very determined on this too. So yeah, how they come back it's hard to see, but not impossible.
Bloomberg's Michael Heath there with the latest on the tensions in the Middle East as we continue to watch just assets across the board, with JGBs rising, Japanese stocks now falling. We'll get more analysis on the escalating tensions in the Middle East with former U.S. Special Envoy Mara Rudman. She joins us later this hour. We're getting more clarity on this week's U.S.-China trade talks in London as well. The two sides agreed to the framework truce achieved a month ago in Geneva. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick says that America's most advanced chips were never on the table. Let's bring in our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel in Hong Kong. Steve, we've been trying to figure out what concessions the U.S. has made. So what have we learned from Lutnick?
Sure. So things are starting to come in line because, again, behind closed doors, we had these talks for 20 hours over 2 days in London, and there was a general feeling that the United States was willing to put certain export controls on the negotiating table if China were then to relax its export controls and speed up its licensing process for very critical rare earths. And I'll talk a little bit more about rare earths in just a second. So there was speculation that perhaps in addition to some of the more recent export controls on like chip design software, on chemicals, on jet engine parts and the like, that maybe some of the most advanced chips for AI training and the like from NVIDIA were also on the table. Well, Howard Lutnick, who you see here in this photo montage with the president, is ruling that out. He says it was never on the table, those advanced chips from the likes of NVIDIA. When he was asked about it, he said, of course not, quote unquote, we're not going to send them our best stuff. And there was even some levity that Howard Lutnick revealed in the negotiations with the Chinese, indicating that Scott Bessent joked that if China wanted no U.S. export controls, it could then send the U.S. its hypersonic missiles and quantum computers. And Lutnick said everybody laughed at the table. So there's some levity, but on very serious subjects, obviously, but a little bit more clarity from the Commerce Secretary that no, these chips, like what you're seeing here on NVIDIA, were not on the table as far as U.S. possibly relaxing those export controls on China.
How much were rare earths substantively on the table, though? Right, they were obviously discussed in London, but this is kind of the crown jewel of how much Beijing has leverage. Where are we seeing progress there?
Believe me, if you have leverage, you're going to use it. And I think China has found that those rare earths are absolutely a critical lever. In fact, some of the research we've shown is that 30 out of the 50 critical elements that are deemed so critical to U.S. defense and other industries are controlled by China, and that they have more than 90% of the rare earth magnets and refining capabilities. So obviously this has become a big lever of leverage, if you will, for the Chinese. Now that leads to the next step, where the Trump administration, according to Bloomberg reporting, is now developing a plan to possibly use Cold War-era powers to prioritize and fund rare earth projects it deems critical to national security. The Defense Production Act would tap financing, loans, and other means for rare earths-related projects in the United States. Right now, there's really only one sole domestic producer of rare earths in the United States, MP Materials, as you're seeing here, based in Las Vegas, Nevada. And again, the Interior Secretary is saying this is a wake-up call for America.
Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engle there with the latest on trade, and of course watching the situation in the Middle East very closely. President Trump planning to convene a cabinet-level meeting as Israel strikes Iran. That's according to reporting from CNN. He is convening that cabinet-level meeting, so we'll continue to watch that very closely. This comes as Israel launched airstrikes on Iran, a major escalation in the standoff over Tehran's atomic program. This is Bloomberg.
We're seeing a flight to safety across the board in Asian assets. We're seeing JGBs rising, treasuries rising as well. Japanese stocks really reversing those earlier gains after we heard from the Israel Defense Minister Katz that he's declared a state of emergency. Of course, we are monitoring what they're calling a special situation after that Israeli attack on Iran. And you can see the skyline on the left right there of Tel Aviv. President Trump planning a cabinet-level meeting, according to CNN, but this was already meeting that was set before the strike, but obviously with the latest developments, we're expecting this to be discussed. We heard from state TV that loud explosions were heard in the Iranian capital as well. Haidi, we'll continue to watch the latest geopolitical developments. We're still trying to figure out where the nuclear conversations with Iran go from here.
Yeah, they are supposed to continue in Oman over the weekend, right? Let's bring in Myra Rudman, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, previously having served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, including with the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Myra, really great to have you with us, and obviously at such a crucial time. It's interesting, President Trump had acknowledged the risk of escalating conflict. He had advised that no action be taken while these negotiations are ongoing, and in fact, we'd spoken to various sources and experts in the area, one of whom said that an attack while these talks were ongoing was inconceivable. Clearly not. Are you surprised that this is a strategy that Israel has taken?
I guess I'm not surprised. Israel has benefited at other times by catching countries, people, regions off guard, by surprise with preemptive attacks. And so in that sense, it's not surprising. What is curious to me is that President Trump went out in front of cameras, and answered questions to press just a couple hours ago. And I was struck that he used the words, "This is not imminent. It may happen, but it's not imminent." I think a strike happening a couple hours after you say that to me is the definition of imminent. So I am a little concerned about where the lines of communication are between the United States and Israel, or whether President Trump just consciously chose to mislead in a press situation. I just don't know.
There's a lot of uncertainties within those scenarios, right? And we know that when it comes to Gaza, there were already concerns over kind of diminished communications between Israel and the US. Where does this leave the sixth round of talks that are supposed to happen in Oman over the weekend? And I suppose where does this also leave Iran in terms of their options, both direct and through proxies, in terms of how they respond?
Yeah, well, let's take a little bit of a step back from the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, though I'm happy to come back to that. I think this is unlikely to be a one-strike action by Israel, given what the concerns are, what the stated objectives have been in terms of removing Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon, and what it would take with what I believe Israel has available to them. I think people should expect a long and extended campaign, and one to which Iran would almost certainly be responding in various ways, which is why you saw the evacuation. Though it was odd, it was authorized and not mandatory evacuation of U.S. embassy personnel and military families in the region.
Yeah, that was interesting because media reporting now that perhaps diplomats also were not aware that an imminent strike was actually about to take place. We're getting some latest lines from Israel that the airspace has been closed until further notice, that they're closing the airspace to takeoffs and landings, all of course, Mara, in order to prepare for retaliatory attacks. What could they look like?
Well, one of the questions here will be how coordinated a response is so that Israel is not protecting itself entirely by itself. Certainly, we saw in previous Iran strikes on Israel in 2024 in 2 instances, there was a good, and this is in President Biden's administration, of course, there was a good deal of coordination with countries in the region, with European countries, and with the United States to help to protect Israel against the Iran strikes in Israel. And it's hard to imagine that in this situation, there also wouldn't be attempts at that kind of coordination, though, again, it would have taken ongoing conversations, which may well have been occurring, just not in public, to ensure that that's the case.
So on the Iran nuclear negotiations, given that the key sticking points like enriching uranium for civilian purposes, they are still there. They still remain. Now we have this escalation of tensions with Israeli airstrikes. So how do they move along from here?
I don't think anytime soon. I would be very surprised if negotiator Witkoff's meeting, which was set to occur in Muscat, Oman, because Oman has been helping to facilitate these discussions between the Iranians and the United States. Those were supposed to occur on Sunday. It's hard for me to imagine that those go forward under current circumstances. And I will also say what is unfortunate is that Iran did not move more quickly to respond affirmatively to what President Trump's team had put on the table. And I say this as no huge fan of this administration. But what they were offering, it's my understanding in terms of Iran's ability to transition slowly away from nuclear enrichment, was basically a kind of a combination of President Biden's JCPOA deal, the U.S., Iran, and other countries negotiated agreement back in 2015, and actually some elements of what President Clinton had offered North Korea at an earlier point. And so Iran had a path in front of it that if they had agreed, and again, more quickly, would have potentially given the United States more ability to forestall Israel's action. And Iran chose not to take that path.
We're now hearing that an Israeli military official has confirmed the attack was targeting Iranian nuclear sites. Mara, you talk about this sort of lost opportunity. If we assume that Iran obviously did not take those opportunities, did not take that trajectory, knowing what the risks are, then what sort of possibilities are open up now? What is the strength or sort of the weakness when it comes to the various Iranian proxies around the region? We know that one of the possibilities in the case of failed negotiations is an attack on other US assets around the region. Hence, I assume why we've also seen key personnel being moved out of various places.
Sure. Well, also, let's be clear. Israel was anxious to take this action at this time or in a window that they saw as rapidly closing because of significant harm they had done to Iran's air defense abilities and to proxies like Hezbollah, which was virtually decimated by Israel's actions in Lebanon and by the takeover in Syria and the fleeing of Assad there. So Israel saw this as an opportunity at a time for them to kind of advance the objective they were seeking. Iran will certainly over time rebuild its proxies, rebuild its air defense. The Houthis are clearly a group to watch in Yemen. They have continued to take all sorts of actions against Israel and against shipping lanes, and there have been warnings about international shipping lanes. And so it's likely, frankly, that the Houthis would take that kind of action with or without Iran pushing or asking them to do so. But Iran's ability with other proxies is much more limited than it was. It will grow again over time.
Mara, how consequential will U.S. public sentiment be in this conflict when, of course, we have seen already the Gaza-Israel conflict, for example, taking some of the attention from U.S. Domestic politicians, the public as well, when usually the American public is not necessarily that veer towards foreign policy?
So I would first think I think it's important to distinguish between what has been Israel's actions in Gaza and the challenges there, I would say, in Israel going forward with a strategy that makes sense for Israel or for Palestinians and for the region. So it's been very destabilizing. But I would distinguish that from the concerns about Iran and Iran gaining the ability to to make and use nuclear weapons, which has been a long concern of the United States, frankly, of presidents going back, Democratic and Republican presidents, Bush, Obama, Biden, as well as Trump. And so that has been a concern. And so in terms of U.S. public opinion, I think the concern about Iran's nuclear ability is quite significant. I will say, and this may be what you're alluding to, in President Trump's own party, there's a real divide. I would say between a much more isolationist, let the rest of the world take care of itself, and little kind of sense or sensibility of how much of a threat the United States would have to withstand. You can't just let the rest of the world take care of itself and think you're going to be safe and Americans are going to be safe. But between those and people who are more keen within his party for intervention. And my guess is some of those discussions are playing out in the cabinet meeting or the National Security Council meeting, which I think it's what it's more likely to be that he's holding tonight.
Rudman, professor at University of Virginia there. Great to have you with us with some context on the Israeli attacks on Iran. Of course, we have seen now oil surging on those reports, heightening tensions in the region that accounts for a third of global crude production. For more, let's bring in Stephen Stepchinsky, who leads our energy coverage. Stephen, just give us some context about the gains that we're seeing really across the commodity space, especially obviously on oil.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously going to be seeing more gains in oil over the day as more details come out. We're up to around $73 for Brent. This is a big gain considering just a few weeks ago we were in the low $60 range and we were talking about a bear market. So the geopolitical risk here, the risk factor, this risk premium is clearly in play at the moment. And I think the market's trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen next. You know, we just had the guest before talking about the situations, but I think traders in the oil market and commodities are looking at maybe a few different scenarios. One, we have the reports that Israel targeted Iranian nuclear infrastructure. If that's the case, what did they hit exactly? Did they disable anything? Were there any direct hits? Iran has taken these sorts of strikes very seriously. So if there is any impact on their nuclear program, then you could see this sort of spiral out of control into a larger conflict where they, instead of doing some sort of, different sorts of drone attacks on Israel in response, you could see them start to target U.S. embassies. You know, the U.S. did evacuate in the region non-military personnel over the last few days, likely in response to maybe an expectation that this was going to happen, even though the U.S. wasn't involved this time. Now, if there was any impact on oil infrastructure, it's still unclear. It doesn't seem that there has been, but if there is any impact on oil infrastructure, that immediately has an impact, again, on the physical oil market. Iran is a major producer of crude oil, and while there are sanctions against Iranian oil, they do ship it on shadow fleet ships. About 1 million barrels per day of production is getting itself on the water. So any impact on that as well could have a physical tightening of the market. At the same time, where does this go from here? The Middle East is a major producer of oil. So if this spirals into a regional conflict, you're also at risk of potentially production issues in other places. It's still too early to tell whether that's going to happen. Now, the be-all, end-all, worst-case scenario would be if Iran were to choose to shut the Strait of Hormuz, which is a major conduit of oil and liquefied natural gas. Now, that would hurt them. They depend on that waterway as well. But if this does spiral into a larger conflict, that's certainly the worst-case scenario that the market is watching in commodities.
Stephen, what are we seeing on the demand side? Is this sort of risk premium enough to kind of sufficiently wipe out any of the concerns when it comes to, the China slowdown, the broader sort of demise of demand as a result of a demise in trade, for example?
Well, certainly we're facing a market that isn't particularly tight, right? You're in a market that has quite a bit of froth. We've been talking about an oversupply. Part of that reason is that OPEC Plus had been adding barrels to the market. Now, Iran is part of this OPEC Plus group, so perhaps there are other, if there is a impact on Iranian production, potentially you could see Saudi Arabia or other countries kind of step in to increase their output, potentially to help make up that deficit. On the demand side, I think we were seeing a rosier picture on demand. I think earlier in the year when the trade war was in full swing and China and the U.S. were at each other's necks, there was an expectation that with these high tariffs, you would see a slowdown in oil demand, not only in China, but also in the United States, if the trade war does have an impact on the economies. But over the last few weeks, you've seen a warming of relations between the U.S. and China, which was a rosy picture in the oil market. If there is there's a trade agreement, potentially the trade will resume and be strong between the two countries, leading to economic growth, and you have people, factories using oil, you have people driving using gasoline. It was painting a somewhat rosier picture for oil, albeit still the Trump factors of potential unilateral tariffs is still risking that position. So at the moment, the market isn't going to be in a shortage, right? You're not going to see lines at the pumps because they're not getting their oil. But certainly, this will create a bit of a situation where you will see prices rise potentially as it continues.
Steven Stepchinsky there, who leads Bloomberg's energy coverage, as we continue to watch the latest developments in the Middle East. We're getting breaking news right now. We're getting the latest statement coming from Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the U.S. is not involved in the strikes, that Israel took unilateral action versus Iran, that Iran should not target U.S. interests or personnel. So again, we're getting the latest statements coming from the Secretary of State in the U.S. saying that America was not involved in the strikes. You can actually get subscribers to turn to the terminal for more on the latest in the Middle East. TLIV Go is your function for the latest updates, plus commentary and analysis from our expert editors, as we're also hearing the latest from a military official saying that Israel is attacking Iran's nuclear program. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. We're seeing broad risk off across Asian assets, with Japanese stocks falling, JGBs rising. Israel has launched an airstrike against Iran's nuclear program. We're also watching the semiconductor space because Meta has just finalized a multi-billion-dollar investment in Scale AI and recruited Scale CEO. In the meantime, right now, the Japanese yen continuing to rise 0.3% as that risk-off sentiment really hits currencies across Asia. And this, of course, at a time when we're seeing dollar weakness to that 2022 low. Let's get more on the market impact with Asia Markets Executive Editor Paul Dobson. And Paul, really, the market repercussions, given, of course, the developments and what we're hearing coming from the Middle East with the Israeli attacks on Iran, just spreading across assets in today's session.
Yeah, hi, good morning, Shery. As you say, the most stark move is clearly in crude oil with a jump of about 5% or thereabouts. But we're also seeing other asset classes moving in sympathy with those moves. We have US stock index futures down and Asian equities also trading lower, and people putting their money back into bonds as a haven asset with yields lower across the board. Gold, the yen, the Swiss franc are the havens as well. I think what you were talking about just then, though, is the really interesting part of this equation, the dollar, which has been under a lot of pressure. But since the US is an oil-producing nation, a much higher oil price, all things being equal, will translate into a slightly higher dollar. Now, the risk is, because it's been on that sort of downward trajectory, a lot of people have been short the dollar going into this event. That could produce something of a squeeze that may see, the dollar become a sort of self-fulfilling move higher, particularly against things like the euro and the pound, where it had been looking vulnerable, but also against some of our Asian currencies. So that's something to watch out for as trading sort of develops through the day.
We're now hearing comments from Benjamin Netanyahu saying that the attacks have been on Iran's nuclear program, their ballistic missiles as well. The strikes will last until the threat is removed, which is an interesting comment in and of itself, because a lot of the assumptions, I think, going into this, first of all, the assumption, I think, broadly was that an attack wouldn't happen until the negotiations between the US and Iran had expired, particularly with a 6th round of talks due in Oman over the weekend. But then the second assumption from people that we've spoken to is that it would be a very contained set of operations. Netanyahu now saying the strikes will last until the threat is removed. Do you think, Paul, the markets are sort of prepared or priced for more of an elongated situation here?
No, Heidi, almost certainly not. This has come a little bit out of the blue, and most likely, and most normally what we see in these kinds of situations is that we have a very strong knee-jerk reaction in the markets in one direction as people sort of assume the worst, and that tends to dissipate and fade back out of markets. That's what we've seen in similar incidents over the past several years. So if the retaliation from Iran escalates things, or if this does indeed turn into something that's a more long-term, drawn-out sort of a situation, then no, the market could most likely extend some of the moves that we've seen today. I think that, probably the assumption from most commentators that my reporters have been speaking to would be that things will quickly recover. So any signs that there's going to be an enduring or escalating situation can still take the market further in the direction that we're seeing it move today.
Right now, we're seeing the Kospi also falling about 1% as the Israel Defense Forces also coming out saying that dozens of Israeli Air Force jets have completed the first stage of the Iran strikes. At the same time, we're seeing the Asia investment-grade bond spreads widening after the strike on Iran. We're seeing, of course, JGBs also continuing to rise. But, Paul, what will drive markets if you expect this knee-jerk reaction from the geopolitical tensions to be short-lived?
Yeah, so I mean, if things pass over relatively quickly, then we will be back to focusing on the trade talks, on the trade situation. We have the G7 meeting coming up this weekend. A lot of interest in not what happens there, but what happens on the sidelines between the US and the various trading partners. I think we have India showing up there. Korea is going as well. And they may be meeting with Canada as well as with the US. So there could be some interesting developments in terms of that trade. The clock is ticking on that. Trump has given us a little bit of a hurry-up warning this week, saying, that we need to come to some kind of trade agreements, or at least the countries need to be showing goodwill in negotiations. Otherwise, the tariffs may come back up to higher levels. So I think that that's the thing that's keeping the market transfixed really at the moment. Yes, the US economic situation and the Fed are interesting as well, and certainly, this Iran situation kind of out of nowhere has people worried. But assuming that does blow over relatively fast, then yes, we'll be back focusing on the trade and the tariff situation again before too long.
Our Asia Markets Executive Editor Paul Dobson there. Clearly, the markets are focusing very, very closely on this. As we've heard confirmation from Benjamin Netanyahu that they're seeking to remove the ballistic missile threat from Iran. He's saying that the strikes will last until that threat is removed. The attack has been on Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missiles. The RDF confirming that dozens of IAF jets have completed the first stage of Iran's strikes. We know that we've also heard from Marco Rubio saying that the US is not involved in these strikes by Israel against Iran, that Iran should not target US interests or personnel, making it very clear that Israel took unilateral action versus Iran. This is interesting to us, right, Shery, because we were just speaking with one of our guests earlier talking about the different scenarios, given that we had heard from President Trump saying that he'd advised against any action being taken until the ongoing negotiations, of which we know the 6th round of talks are expected to happen in Oman over the weekend between the US and Iran, that they had expired. So we had been wondering whether this was a case where there had been more US intelligence, but clearly Marco Rubio here in his statement very, very clearly wanting to separate the US, saying we are not involved in these strikes.
And how difficult those negotiations will be going forward, right? Given, of course, the key sticking points remain, including the enriching of uranium for civilian purposes that Iran wants. And Israel right now bracing for possible retaliation by Iran as well. Of course, we have seen Israel's Defense Minister Katz declaring a state of emergency, Israel closing the airspace to takeoffs and landings. So they're really getting ready for any sort of retaliation coming from Iran. And we have seen in the past from the U.S. that they've jumped to the defense of Israel from potential attacks in the past. So helping defend Israel, of course, will be one key issue that will be discussed by U.S. officials as they have that cabinet meeting that President Trump is going to oversee. But you can see right now that risk-off sentiment across the board in the Asian markets. We have seen Japanese stocks turning negative, JGBs rising, the yen also rising. That's it from the Asian trade. Our markets coverage continues. The China show is next. This is Bloomberg.